Okay, so I'm actually here with two faculty members or two professors, Mary Crossan and Corey Crossan. And oddly enough, they're mother and daughter. And so Mary Crossan is a distinguished professor at University of Western Ontario. It's kind of a big deal, but let's not worry about that. But she's also here with her daughter, Corey, who's running the Oxford Character Project. She's at the University of Oxford and doing both research and as well as building an app and teaching as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, this is
And
super.
I would say, Corey, just you probably want the correction. You don't run the Oxford Character Project.
I was going to jump in.
Gotcha.
I definitely don't run it.
It'd be like saying I run the Ivey Business School.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah,
absolutely. So, let's start with there. How on earth? So let's start with Mary first. I think there's a genealogical order that I think makes sense. Is that Mary went and did multiple degrees at one school and then became a professor there and continued to do this. Why on earth did you do this?
Well,
why did you stay in this game?
Yeah, it's a great question because I almost didn't. I only did it because on all steps of the way I fell into the career. So that's probably not, what many people have. That's not necessarily their path, but I was finishing an MBA. My husband was finishing a law business degree, and it was, what am I going to do in London, Ontario for a period of time while he finished? And so this teaching job came up, and I fell in love with teaching. That was the thing. And then people said it was sort of like your union card. You needed a PhD if you wanted to teach at a university. So I began to take some courses to see if I wanted to do a PhD. And it was like, oh, to me, the PhD was hard slog. Like I just really felt, this counting angels on the head of a pin idea was, it really wasn't my natural inclination at all. So I persevered through it. But at the time, I'd say I was always intrigued by, I never let go of my interest in trying to solve problems in the so-called real world, right? I was interested in strategy, and I just wondered why organizations did strategy so poorly, because it didn't seem like rocket science to me. So what was it? And I began to study organizing. So in the midst of it, I think I just became a little bit intrigued by what I would call deep theory to deep practice, right? Trying to understand phenomena. And I suppose, and we're going to talk later about the stuff about character. I kind of wish I knew it then. But I think I'm just a determined enough person that I probably had a stubbornness about me on how I went through things, because a lot of times people would tell me, don't do something, stop doing it. And it wasn't that I wanted to prove them wrong. That wasn't it. It's just that I really followed my intuition a lot. And it was things that I felt like, okay, I'm going to have to do this. So but by the time I finished my PhD, I was probably pretty clear that I didn't think academia was for me. Because there had been too many people that were just saying, don't do this. This is too hard. This is that. And then it was actually Paul Beamish, my colleague, who said to me, but how do you know until you try? And that was a bit of a turning point. I said, well, I'm going to navigate this career in a way that I think it should be. And that, I think, even pre-tenure was really tricky and difficult to do, both in teaching and research. But there was this part of me, maybe I'd also pick up an accountability that I really felt like I had to try. And so, the pathway, not easy about taking that kind of pathway, but I'd say it turned out to be really rewarding for me personally. in how I've navigated my career. So that'd be, I think, my story. Again, not without its turmoil, like for sure, in the midst
Mm-hmm.
of it. But I think there were some things that made it possible.
So where do you think that this stubbornness comes from?
Um, well, I think again, from the character standpoint, we'll use the lens of character about it. I had both my parents very strong characters, so I think they're a part of me that comes from it. My mother was quite imbalanced, actually. Lots of courage, drive, transcendence, low temperance. My dad very balanced about it, but I think I saw from my mother this. I'm not even sure stubbornness is necessarily the full appreciation. It's just being able to see something that others can't see and a willingness to take the risk to do it. So I'd say I got that, from her, from my father, um, just a steadiness about how he managed things. And then I have 8 brothers and sisters, so I'm in a bit of an ecosystem
Wow.
where where many of them operated that way. So it just was kind of the way I grew up. And by the way, I think that becomes a really important storyline as we go forward around character, is that I realize that a lot of the ways that I believe about something, my core beliefs, my scripts, are not the scripts of other people, and they're not the same conditions. So the risks that I would take around things like vulnerability is, I realize now I had such unconditional love in my life. My parents, no matter what I did, they didn't judge what I did. Neither did my brothers and sisters. And even now, I look at my husband, my kids. They're the conditions that really set up for the scripts that I've had, that they work for me. But there are many people, those scripts, just work hard enough and you'll get there, is not a script that works for other people when they're fighting in tremendous headwinds around their psychological safety and not having safety nets.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm hearing is that you almost need to have this surrounding this culture in as you're growing up, a feeling that it's okay to do things that are strange and weird, and people are going to laugh at you and make fun of you and all of those kind of things. Um, how was that something that your parents told you? Was that like, or was this just something that they just did?
It's something that they did, and then when you get Corey's take on this, because she specializes in the development of character, this is something we want to try to make sure you're not just relying on exemplars who they themselves cannot talk about or do not understand where they came from. So partly what you're hearing from me is I now have an awareness for where these 11, dimensions of character come from. And I know where my virtues can operate like vices. And I can explain that, right, to others. And I can help people see in themselves how we can then use these muscles of character to support the work we do in academia.
Okay, so one of the things that so when given the timeline that you were going through this, you decided to have in your as an assistant professor, you decided to have 2 kids, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm not sure. It's a miracle, right? How it
Yeah.
all happened. Um, and that seems to me like if much of the advice out there would say, or much of the zeitgeist would say, like, that is absolutely insane. What are you doing? Right? Like you're going to ruin your career, especially given the time period of when you would have been doing that, when we're still opening up the possibility of having complicated family work life thing in our culture. I think it's still evolving. Um, so my question is um, how did you manage this tension that we often face of like, this is what an ideal researcher, an ideal scholar or leader, whatever looks like. And that the conversation never revolves around having kids and, having shortfalls and all of those kind of things.
Yeah, you're right. At the time I came in, I believe I was only the second tenure track woman hired. And then as soon as I was hired, I was pregnant. And and that was by choice. But also, my husband and I had been married 7 years at that point, and we were thinking, he was in law early stages of it. We were both thinking, oh, maybe we wait till he's partner and I'm get tenure. And then we said, give our head a shake. Like, you can't do those kinds of things. You're going to have to figure out how to manage that. So I got the job, and probably within, a few weeks, I was telling them I was pregnant. And the first reaction was, oh shit, and, very funny story about this though is, many just thought it was going to disrupt the entire planet because I was pregnant. And then soon they found out a couple of my male colleagues in the strategy group left for other places. And then at one point they joked that, well, I think the only people we can count on are Mary and the baby, so it shifted from, oh shit, to, and the very funny thing about with Corey, so Corey is the oldest of the two. She was just a great baby, and she was born in. At that time, I did run, teach September to May and try to get my research done in the summer. And I actually only took. I'm not suggesting this to anybody else, but she was just so good that I just took a couple of weeks of holidays, and then I took her with me to the office, and I went to conferences, and I was breastfeeding with her and just took her places. So there was a little bit you're going to hear in this story of, why not just chart the path that you want until somebody tells you you can't do it? And that, that's kind of the where all of that played out.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, Corey, can you tell me so did you know all of this was going on and how kind of unusual it is, I guess, in the academic game? I don't know if you want to introduce yourself first and then, talk about your experiences with this.
Yeah, sure. So I think I've been really lucky to have a mom in academia, especially someone that has paved her own path. And I didn't always have the aspirations of being in academia. So I did my undergrad in the States because I thought I wanted to be a professional golfer. So it wasn't like because my mom was in academia, this was always something I had my eyes set on. I kind of fell into research as I chose to leave sport. So I didn't know what I wanted to do after my undergrad. And because probably I had a mother in academia, she said, well, why not a master's? You can't go wrong with a master's. So I fell into a master's and absolutely fell in love with the research, and that's why I continued on with a PhD. But I think I was
Was
really
this
lucky.
all at the same school as well? Was this all at Western?
So I did my undergrad in the States, and then my master's and PhD was at Western. Yes.
Oh my gosh.
And I think I was like extremely lucky because, of course, I had the insights, like a kind of a logistical, practical insights, but the character piece that she brought in terms of the insights really helped me. So, for example, I'm a person that does a lot better work when I'm aligned with the purpose behind it. And so the research I did in my master's and my PhD, they were governed by, or my supervisors would enable me to do what I wanted with my research, and they were really supporting me along the way. Whereas I know that there's a lot of other research where you kind of slot into the research that's already available. So these are really practical things that my mom was able to guide me on and know that that was important to me. But I think a lot of the other things too that came along with it that I think can be really challenging in a PhD, for example, where you are kind of balancing respecting your supervisors, for example, but pushing forward towards what you think is important. And so I recall a few times where, you know, my supervisors from a very good point of view are telling me maybe you should think about this, maybe you should do this. And then I'd come home and chat with my mom about it, and she would say, you know what, you can have a different point of view. You can think about something different. And I think a lot of people don't have that other perspective to kind of bounce those ideas off of. And so I was really lucky with feeling a sense of accountability and responsibility in the work that I was doing, while also trying to balance that respect and, listening to the supervisors that I had. And then, of course, charting your own path. So as I have left my PhD and gotten into that area of academia, um, I've really been kind of split between the typical kind of tenure track position versus more of the practical approach, even getting into the consultancy, or as we've been developing the mobile app that's really research based, is how do you have a foot in both worlds? And I think that as much as we talk about having a foot in both worlds, it's actually really challenging. It feels like you don't really truly belong in one place or the other. And it does take a lot of character to be able to continue to chart that own path. And as my mom was sharing, you may as well just chart your own path until someone says no, but it takes a lot of character to be able to do that. It's really hard to be able to do that. First of all, to imagine what does that path look like, the courage to be able to ask for things that are different, that don't exist, the humility to feel like you don't quite belong in one place or the other. So it's been tricky and challenging, but the more and more you chart that path, the more rewarding it gets every single time you make that difficult decision to deviate.
So I'm curious, what's your earliest memory of your mom working, um,
Thing.
or being part of that weird world?
So I remember, I don't know if I would have been sick or if it would have been like a PD day or whatever, something where I would be off and my mom would take us to work. And so she was actually, I remember she's at the Ivey Business School, which is in a new building, but I actually remember it in the old building. I don't know how old I would have been, but I remember going into the office. I remember eating the free food as a kid, being really excited about that. But I definitely would join her at random, kind of like at her office or sit at the back of the classroom. And yeah, it was pretty normal to see her working, and sometimes she'd work at home. So I don't know how old I would have been, Mom, when you
Mm.
first brought me to or I guess it depends when I first remember.
Yeah, you were there probably within 2 weeks of your life in a
Right.
stroller, but there became a point where you and Matt would be hanging out. You may remember, Dave, the NCMRD, that nice glass area.
Yeah,
They would
yeah.
sit in there. They loved the hot chocolate. The two of them would sit in there. They color or something like that. My office was down the way. Yeah, so yeah, it was pretty natural. And then for you guys also, always bring work like your piano lessons when you were probably starting piano when you were 5. You probably weren't noticing so much, but I was sitting there, doing something, reading something, writing something, listening to you play, watching you play, or hockey or volleyball, or so it was pretty interwoven.
Did you feel really scattered? Like to me, I need a lot of concentration.
No, no, I think that's one thing, but it could be the nature of who I am, is that I can pick up fast and move from one thing to another. And it's really worked well for me to totally intermingle my personal and professional life. It's I don't see the separate. I work every day, but I also don't have any problem taking time out in a day and doing whatever needs to be done. Like it just all kind of works, flows for me, about what I do.
Okay. And then Corey, you sounded like that you were fairly talented growing up in various different things. Um, Tell me about the journey of how you actually became, you ended up going into golfing. Do you remember any of this? Like, what was going on at that time. And there's a question that I want to go to towards
Yeah.
after this that's related to character.
Yeah, so my parents got us into sports, music, dance, all the extracurriculars from a very young age. And while I liked other things like music and dance, I definitely gravitated towards the sports. And it was always sports first in my interests. And school was just something I had to get done and do well in order to play sports. It was a privilege to play sports. So we had to keep the school on track. But ultimately, between the sports that I really loved as I was getting older, you essentially do have to make a choice as you get more competitive and competitive. And I had um, a really deliberate choice around choosing golf because of the potential to actually make a living in golf as a woman. There's actually a really good tour, the LPGA tour, where you can make a good living. Whereas the other sport that I really liked was volleyball, and that was less feasible from a professional standpoint. I almost did quit golf though, going into university, and I remember having a really serious sit down with my parents and thinking about how can you kind of essentially choosing to keep a door open instead of closing it too early. So I did really try out the golf thing all through undergrad, and it was a great experience. But ultimately, it wasn't something that I loved. And actually, now moving into academia, it's something that I love like 200% more than I did with golf, and I didn't know it at the time.
Yeah, so that's my question that I was leaning towards is that you must have found it very difficult to make this transition. I mean, you at least for me, when I invest heavily into something, everybody says it's a sunk cost fallacy. I actually don't believe in a sunk cost fallacy anymore because I think it's just life. You make these large investments in our lives to build a competency, and all of a sudden you're saying, I can't do it anymore. Um,
Hmm.
that feel like.
Yeah, it was like to say it was challenging is, I think, an understatement. It was probably one of the hardest years of my life. And funny enough, though, I didn't think about it as a sunken fallacy, I think that's what you called it.
Sunk cost. Yeah.
Sunken cost, yeah, because I was really lucky that my parents pushed me to continue to focus on school. So I did feel like I had other things available to me as opposed to kind of starting all over, which actually my husband was trying to get into the Olympics and had stopped school. So when he had to turn that dream around, I saw how difficult it was for him to kind of start up again. Whereas I had more options readily available to me, but what was really hard was I would call the identity change or loss of identity because I had put everything, I've understood everything in my life about being a high performance athlete, and no longer being that felt like I didn't know who I was. And I had to go through a full year of trying to recreate the systems that were healthy for me, recreating a new identity or understanding who I still was despite not having sport. So it was extremely challenging. And I'm not too proud of the person I was during those years, but I'm really proud of who I've become after going through, essentially kind of recreating these systems that I know can help support, like a healthy lifestyle.
But I think you should be proud of yourself during that moment, right? Like, I think we beat ourselves up so much about these moments of change and thinking about it. And in reality, I think if you were, and I'm sure you know this, if you were to poll and take a survey of every athlete that's going through that transition, they all struggle with it, right?
Yeah,
And how,
yeah. I think like definitely looking back, and if I were looking at any athlete going through that transition, I would say the same thing. But like how I felt in that year was far from feeling proud. Like it was a constant daily struggle to just kind of get out of bed and figure out what you wanted to do next. It was really challenging.
do you
And
remember a
to
key
add,
moment?
I was just going to just add, and she was doing it on her own. Like she didn't really want, she was really clear is that I need to figure out who I am apart from everybody. So just to, yeah, I know you were going to go into key moments, but, recognize that Like we were there as a safety net. She didn't really use us. That's a fair statement. And Corey, you really wanted to figure out your own system. You were building it from the ground up in that year.
And I think that was a really interesting takeaway, and it could apply to anyone outside of like any system that people have grown up in. We talk about with character how your character can be impacted by the systems you live within, for better or for worse. And I think I was quite lucky growing up in sport that there were pretty good systems around me in terms of supporting your drive and your health and your fitness, like a lot of the basics that help people feel good. And I realized that as soon as I was taken out of that system, I hadn't intentionally created any of these habits or aims or interests for myself. So I felt like all of that had been stripped away, and I had to figure out what does a healthy, purposeful lifestyle look like for me. And it just felt like I was starting from the ground up.
So what does a healthy, purposeful life look like for you?
So I did what I found that I had to do was I call it starting with the basics. So what I had quickly let go after getting out of sport was my exercise, sleep, and nutrition. That had kind of slipped right away. And I felt like those were like the physiological building blocks to just get myself physically at a healthy state again. And as I was doing that, I feel like the character work that I was falling into around cultivating some of the missing components for me, like humility, transcendence, like really trying to carve out doing meaningful work, also then helped kind of elevate my sense of purpose while taking care of the basics around, just health, nutrition, sleep.
So I think that the basics are incredibly important. And we live in a culture. So in sport, the basics kind of overline, right? So the metrics overline with just living a healthy life. You have to eat well, you have to get sleep because that's how you become a good athlete. Um, but many of the occupations that many of us get into, that's no longer aligned. And
Hmm.
we have to intentionally figure out how to, get sleep. And particularly in the academic research game, we see this, or maybe it's law or whatever, where you're trying to strive for that pinnacle, whatever that, I don't even know what that is.
Hmm.
But um, how did you figure out how to maintain that challenge of, it's one thing to just simply say, I'm gonna, be healthy and all of
Yeah.
that, but how do you maintain those conflicting, I guess, virtues and vexes, or I can't remember quite the language that you're
Yeah.
working on. But how do you
Yeah.
maintain that?
I think it's such like when we do our character development programs, when we focus on the dimension of drive, there's a behavior within it called vigorous. And it's this idea of bringing like vitality, energy to the work that you do. And so that's where we focus on these basic pillars. And it is something that everyone says that they struggle with. They're always challenged because especially when you get into the, professional context, it's so easy to feel like getting one task done in the next half an hour gives you that immediate reward, whereas taking a little extra time to prepare a nutritious meal, go for a half an hour run, or go to bed a little bit earlier, it doesn't feel as immediately rewarding. And so I think it's paying attention to that and really thinking about what your non-negotiables are. For me, I started to realize personally how much it affected everything else. So, for example, in the app that we'd created, there's a daily reflection that we do where you one of the things that you look at is you keep track of your mood. And we use the positive affect, negative affect scale, which essentially has 10 positive moods, 10 negative moods. And I started noticing a lot of times that I would check off a feeling guilty at the end of the day. And I was not aware of this feeling at all until I had this intentional reflection around it. And I realized that taking off guilty started happening when I made small compromises on the things that mattered most to me. And because I had come from a life of sport, my undergrad was in exercise science. sleep, nutrition, and exercise are really high values for me. And so whenever I compromised on those in the day, I felt guilty because I wasn't living in alignment with who I wanted to be that day. So I quickly realized that these are absolute non-negotiables for me, no matter how busy life gets. I know that everything else for me falls apart when I don't have those three pillars there. And I know that values can change from person to person, but I would probably suggest that whether people know it or not, having those three things in place is actually really important no matter who you are. And I think it's just noticing the knock-on effect that those things can have if you don't put them in place.
So, Mary, I'll come back to you. One of the things that I'm hearing is that perhaps, and don't take this the wrong way, Corey, is that she raised you really well. And that perhaps she was dedicating a whole bunch of time to making sure that you were successful. How do you balance this as a parent of figuring out, okay, I need to get food, sleep, um, exercise, and all of those things, and I'm a professional. How are you able to do this?
Yeah, this applies to all of us. Is A lot of this conversation has been about either or, and I think one of the first things is don't rule out the and. I think the moment that you accept it's either or, you're already down a reduced set of possibilities. And so you're really trying to imagine in your world ways that's possible, that you have the and side of things. So for example, one of my loves, I could sport, I love to coach. And so I ended up coaching both my son and my daughter's high school volleyball teams. I had to find 2:30 to 4 in an afternoon. So, this is why I'm working 7 days a week, because I had the love of coaching. I get some of my physical, fitness in coaching and doing those kinds of things, while I also got to spend time with my kids and learn about their friends and, deal with the joy that I had of coaching and playing volleyball while I did what I did. So we often talk about, I love the Viktor Frankl quote, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in that response lies our growth and our freedom. And I think, many of us transact through that space, but there's a lot you can do in that space.
Can you talk a little bit about Viktor Frankl? I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
the entire audience would know who this person is.
So he was a survivor of Auschwitz, and he wanted to understand why some people survived and others perished. And it's a very short book, Man's Search for Meaning, but it really was that a cornerstone of this survival is a search for meaning. And I do think he got a lot of things right. When we think about character, like you heard Corey talked about that purposiveness, right? It's part of transcendence. Having that meaning in your life matters. And, we would pick up things like, now just to bounce off of what he would talk about, is he said our power to choose our response. Well, we would pick up that it actually takes a lot of character to see choice, to have choice. It takes courage to have choice. It takes transcendence to see choice. It takes accountability to live choice. It takes a lot of temperance, right, to manage this space, like who you want to be between stimulus and response. So partly what we're trying to do around the development of character is equip people with that quality of who they are, so that they can see the world differently, operate in it differently. And that's really kind of the basis of it. Corey, did I kind of catch it well enough?
Sorry, I was looking for the mute button. Yeah, nothing to add.
It's okay. You don't have to mute either. It's unless there's lots of noise in the background. So what I'm hearing, one of the things that I like to say, because I like to interpret my own way of viewing this is that in how I often feel, I have to feel weird often, right? Like, so there's one way to say it positively is that you're building character, but to me, it's like, oh, it's this weirdness. I don't quite fit in. I don't have, I don't have to abide by these sort of norms that are often part of what we actually do. And it's balancing that feeling of almost like aimlessness, right? So if you go back to the sort of old sociology research, where one of the challenges that we face as human beings is that we have a lot of opportunity and a lot of choices, particularly today. And I think that's part of what we're struggling with as a society is we have so many choices at this moment because we're all rich, right? You start looking across many countries, there's a lot of prosperity today. How do you balance these sort of tensions in terms of our character? Is that something that you can teach? Is this, I mean, it's the age-old question that many of us have heard before is why would character matter?
Mm. Well, I'll start with that, why it matters, and then Corey's the expert on the development front. I think we underestimated why it mattered. We thought about it as ethics or something about that or morals, and that you were operating with one hand behind your back if you were operating with character. But we missed the boat. We missed the fact that it's really the horsepower around both well-being and sustained excellence. I wrote this piece about character as the aerodynamic. We talk about leader character, but we're really talking about the disposition to lead. I talked about it as the aerodynamics of leadership. That piece that we didn't see. And there's an engineering about it, right? You think about, well, what would this look like? And then I'll pass it over to Corey then, that once we understood the architecture of what character was, the really interesting part is because it's habit. Now we're into the exercise science literature to help us understand how to develop the habit. So Corey, maybe over to you on that one.
And before getting into the habit piece, I do think like the framework that Mary's talking about that has 11 dimensions, it absolutely changed my life in terms of my well-being and my performance because it started to help me see how our strengths can operate as vices. They sort of backfire without the support of other dimensions. So for me, as an athlete, I had really cultivated a lot of drive, but it was becoming this kind of striving for excellence, turning into striving for perfection, which actually started giving me a lot of performance anxiety and then chronic anxiety throughout my entire life because I started to realize I didn't have a lot of parts of humility that would support my high drive. So the idea that you can actually learn and grow and that you don't have to be perfect now. And so trying to actually cultivate these missing pieces of character that are often neglected or not valued has absolutely transformed my life. And that's where I became really interested in how do we intentionally develop these things because I think people assume your character develops over time or it strengthens over time. But I've seen that character can atrophy over time. I saw it in parts of my athletic endeavors. And so this idea that you're always becoming something for better or for worse. So what are the systems or strategies we can put in place to make sure that we're actually becoming more courageous, more humble, more driven instead of losing that without knowing it over time? So, I mean, we have lots of other, frameworks and the science behind how we can develop these things, but essentially we talk about going to the character gym. So how can you intentionally exercise these character muscles on a day-to-day basis? And a lot of the research coming out of the Oxford Character Project identifies 7 strategies for character development. We've developed 5 stages of character development, just starting off with discovering what does your character look like. We call it putting on the character glasses that help you see yourself and others in a more kind of intentional way. It gives you this really rich vocabulary to understand who you're becoming so that you can implement these strategies that help you intentionally become the person you want to be.
So one of the things that I've been struggling with because I sort of evolved along the way that I think your mom or Mary had, looked at this is that, hey, wait a minute, um, we look at the world in terms of academics, we think of the world as very cut and dry. We often talk about actors and agents, that these are not human beings. And all of a sudden, we're ascribing all of these old um, values and virtues that we've talked about for 3,000 years or more, right, for a long time. Um, to me, that doesn't seem academic, right? It doesn't seem like we're actually doing real research. How do we reconcile this? Or how are you reconciling this?
Do you mean the character work not being academic, or is
Yeah,
that, or do you mean?
so at one point, right, if you start looking at the philosophy of all this, it we've known these things for a long time, and a lot of what we've done in science in the last 100 years is that we've depersonalized things,
Right,
right? We
right.
look at things
Yeah.
in a very so if you fix the system, I guess, or you just
Hmm.
focus on decision makers, and we just call them decision makers, and they don't have
Yeah.
any personality or any other character, then they're going to make the right choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So, well, one thing is we're challenging that assumption. But first of all, you have to do the good science work around character, right, to establish it. So we've been able to port it from philosophy. It went into psychology. Now bringing it into the management domain. So that in itself is a lot of heavy lifting. And then Corey's exercise science and habit development. But now what we've been able to do is challenge assumptions. So we've got this paper now, it's actually just under review, which looks at recasting theories of strategy with the fact of our assumptions about strategic actors, boundedly rational, for example. So we're actually trying to then, you know, realize that we didn't get the aerodynamics, right. That we've been looking in the wrong places. And so what's been fun about what we've been able to do now is once we had this sort of platform and architecture of understanding character, we're now able to actually question and recast other theories. Even think about how many theories where we're finding curvilinear relationships between things like grit, low and high, not so good, moderate, better. Well, because take grit would be something like tenacity and determination and character. But it didn't look at the fact that in order to have that high level of tenacity, you also need the humility and temperance to go along with it. So it would be a wrong conclusion to assume that you want to actually reduce your tenacity or determination. But the fact that you want that high level, it needs other concepts and constructs to come in. So the neat part about character, I think, is given that we are on this evidence science-based approach to it, we're now actually questioning all sorts of theories that we've had in place about why we've been successful or not.
I love that. I love that. I think that there is so much to be said here. And essentially, you're looking at um, bigger dimensions, I guess, that actually impact how, maybe it is culture is formed in a company, or maybe how routines are formed, right? The sort of things that often we look at. In some way, you're looking at a lower level of just the actor itself, and just saying that this is just an actor or decision maker, but there's a lot of nuance
Right.
behind them.
Well, so we wrote a piece recently how culture is a reflection of character. So we picked up on the old Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and we said, well, character eats culture for breakfast. And the article then is about, recasting our understanding about what culture is based on the notion that it is a reflection of our character. And so we've been, again, using a lot of different lenses and theories that we're saying are really been problematic because we haven't understood character. We wrote a piece about, for example, linking character and organizational learning. So we're we're very much taking a multi-level systems perspective, but trying to highlight that at the core of it, the atomic particle is the character of the individual.
One of the things that Corey, you said, and I think we only have a few more moments as well, but one of the things that you had said is that you spent your whole life trying to be perfect.
Mm.
How do you learn to be imperfect?
Yeah. So, and by the way, I don't think I intentionally tried to be perfect my whole life. It was something that kind of snuck up on me. I had I
I
had
think it's
role
absolutely
models.
normal.
Yeah, I had role model. I mean, it came at a very young age. I remember some funny stories about teachers being worried about me. I think they called in my parents. I was 4 or 5 because I would draw shoes on a person 100 times to get it perfect, even at the age of 4 or 5. And then I had a music teacher early on that demanded excellence out of me. And then golf is a sport that, you feel like you can be perfect at. Anyway, so it kind of snuck up on me. I think this idea of not trying to weaken things that you've developed really well. So not trying to be less perfect. I think when an interesting actually mental performance thing I learned in golf is that when you tell yourself not to do something, all your mind hears is to do it. So don't hit it in the water. All your mind hears is it visualizes the water. And so I think this idea of trying not to do something is actually really difficult. And that's why I really like the character architecture, where it's what else could I work on actively to make sure that my striving for excellence doesn't operate in a bad way around perfection. And it was for me the humility piece. How do I have the vulnerability to be able to make mistakes and know that I can learn from those? So it's actually feeling like you have an issue here, but following the thread elsewhere and figuring out what else might I be lacking that could better support this strength that's backfiring on me.
So I completely resonate. The only reason I asked that question is I completely resonate with that. Is that in my mind, I think that people are going to love me more the more perfect I actually am.
Mhm.
And it was having to deal with in high school. I was a lonely kid. I didn't have a lot of friends. And so I started to like, oh, if I just perfect myself, do fitness and get good grades and all those things, all of a sudden everybody's going to love me. It doesn't happen, right? So a huge part of me is learning how to be imperfect, and that is totally fine. And that makes me feel more like I can talk to you. I would have been nervous talking to you. I still am a little nervous, but learning that it's okay to stutter or look weird or be uncomfortable has been a it's made huge impact on my life. To
Mhm.
simply say that I don't have to be always the way that other people want me to be, and accepting myself for that.
Mhm.
Um, it's such a journey that we all go through, right? It's this learning journey that we all go through. So
And
tell
I
me
think
about this. Go ahead.
I just want to pick up on that because I think it's a really interesting example of how, like, both you and I have talked about struggling with perfectionism, but if you follow the thread through the character architecture, you kind of find different ways to kind of embrace or work on it. So, what I was actually hearing from you when we look at the character framework is looking at your integrity, so like your authenticity, who you are, and trying to kind of allow that to shine through a little bit more, no matter. Um, Even if it's different than what people expect of you. So it's kind of like we're both coming at it from slightly different angles depending on what we might be lacking more of. And I think that's the really cool part about character is that there's not like a one size fits all way to work on kind of improving yourself.
Yeah, Corey, that's such a huge point because it was always interesting. I didn't see her striving. I wish I had this as a parent earlier in my life because I didn't, I don't strive for perfection. So it wasn't even something that I was noticing, for example, in her. But I have other kinds of qualities like that. That humility for me is I discovered false humility. don't want to be the center of attention, don't want to be, could see myself as humble. But what I realized for me getting out of that space was sort of this accountability to bring to the world that which I see. And that part was an instinct that was always there for me. You heard that in the early part of my story. But it wasn't just relying on my determination to get me there. I think that notion of developing the humility and the transcendence and the temperance about it was to do it more joyfully, with less hardship, because you can rely on your strengths. I'll just be the bull in the china shop to get it done. But what I do find now is there's so much, I think, through the character work, an emphasis on bringing joy to the work that we do and meaning around that work, recognizing we are in probably one of the toughest professions out there. So anybody who struggles in academia, for good reason, and nobody gave us the development and strength of character to navigate the profession that we're in, which is a piece that we find is a big shortcoming.
So with that, can you tell me a little bit about this app that you're building? What does it look like? How could people reach out to you? What would you like future researchers, future academics to take away in terms of all of this amazing stuff you're doing in terms of the Character Project?
Do you want to talk about the app, Corey? And then I'll just talk about, well, you could do a lot about it because even it has big research implications as well. Why don't you take it away?
There's a lot to talk about, but I'll try and keep it brief. Like I said earlier, it's really like the character gym. So as you think about trying to develop stronger muscles, you go to the gym. Essentially, we've created like a system, an app that helps you strengthen these. And I think the biggest part is just actually discovering what your character looks like and being able to strategically target those dimensions that you may have been overlooking. And so by strengthening those, by going to the character gym, we essentially have daily exercises, character exercises that help you strengthen those. It should really kind of enhance your ability to do whatever it is that's most important to you. So we also get people to reflect on what their performance looks like, what their relationships look like, what their mood looks like. We call those flourishing outcomes. That's a kind of big area in character. And so whatever people want to improve, especially, if they are academics, it's noticing what their character looks like and how it's undermining or supporting their efforts. I think that's really like the practical side of it. And the really other interesting piece of it is that we've really developed it as an evidence-based tool, because I think a lot of times we're doing things in leadership development that are just, we call the smile test. They make you feel good, but are they actually changing behaviors over time? And importantly, we can do a lot of really interesting research with it. Everything people put into the app, it's data that can be collected, and actually we can really take a detailed approach to understanding how people's character develops. What is the impact of that development? So, there's a lot that could be talked about. Mary, did I miss anything key that you think would be important to share?
Just reinforce that notion that we want it for individual development. We want this accountability for us. I often said I don't want to leave this planet without embedding everything I know about how to develop character that's universally available to others. And then thank goodness Corey has been this immense powerhouse in doing all of this work. The idea that it can be used as interventions in organizations. So just mounting a study, I didn't even share this with you, Corey, yesterday, but in the healthcare field, looking in cardiac care, and they want to understand how might character be brought into cardiac care and affect outcomes, patient outcomes, judgment and decision-making about it. We could be using the app as the evidence based on character development. It has everything that's in it. And you can be looking at the effect on various outcomes as a result of what happens when we start to develop character. So what I like about the work is that I do believe it's going to be transformative for ourselves as researchers and, to navigate the work that we're doing more joyfully and perhaps imaginatively about what we can do. And it also then has this great opportunity to recast research that we're doing in a way that we haven't been looking at.
That's all very, very exciting. And I just want to thank you so much for spending the hour to talk to this this audience. They're definitely, the reciprocity audience is definitely going to get something out of this. There were some really key moments that I got out of it. And so I just want to deeply thank you for spending the time to be here.
Great to be on it and chat with you again, Dave.